Imagine a world where your voice, your thoughts, your very existence in public could be dismissed, ignored, or outright suppressed, simply because of who you were. What if daring to speak up could cost you your reputation, your livelihood, or even your safety? How did women navigate a world where their public voices were systematically quieted nearly 1,000 years ago, in the year 1170? Number 7. Legal and ecclesiastical decrees. In the year 1170, the very framework of society, built by men and for men, often contained clauses and principles that directly chipped away at a woman's right to speak or be heard in public. This wasn't just about informal social customs. We are talking about actual laws and the powerful doctrines of the church, which held immense sway over daily life. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to argue your point in a debate where the rules themselves state you are not allowed to use certain words or even participate at all. That was the reality for many women. One of the most profound ways women were silenced through legal and religious decree was in the hallowed halls of justice and worship. Consider the church. For centuries, interpretations of biblical texts, particularly those attributed to figures like St. Paul, were used to justify women's silence in religious settings. Passages like "Let women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted them to speak," from 1 Corinthians, were not just suggestions. They became foundational principles enshrined in canon law, the law of the church. This wasn't a casual rule, it was a divine commandment, interpreted and enforced by powerful bishops and priests across Christendom. A woman daring to speak out of turn in a church service, perhaps to question a sermon or offer her own theological insight, would not merely be considered rude. She would be seen as defying God's own word, an act of grave impropriety that could lead to public rebuke, excommunication, or even more severe penance. Imagine the weight of such a threat hanging over any woman's head as she entered the sacred space. Beyond the spiritual realm, legal systems of the time were equally restrictive. Public courts, whether royal courts, manorial courts, or nascent urban tribunals, were overwhelmingly male domains. Women's capacity to participate, particularly as independent agents, was severely limited. For example, in many legal traditions across Europe, a woman's testimony in court was often considered less reliable than a man's. Sometimes, a woman was not even permitted to offer testimony unless she was under the guardianship of a male relative, her father, husband, or brother. Her voice, her account of events, had to be filtered or validated through a man. She could not, for instance, typically represent herself in a legal dispute over land or property, even if it rightfully belonged to her. If her husband died, leaving her entangled in legal battles, she would likely need a male relative to speak on her behalf, presenting her arguments and concerns as his own. This wasn't just abstract legal theory. Imagine Alara, a widow in a small Norman village, whose husband's distant cousin suddenly claimed a portion of her dower land, the property set aside for her use after her husband's death. Alara knew the truth. She had witnessed the original transfer. She knew the history of the land and her family. Yet, when the dispute came before the local manorial court, Alara was not allowed to directly address the reeve or the assembled villagers acting as a jury. She had to rely on her brother, a man who, though well-meaning, lacked her intimate knowledge of the land and her husband's intentions. Her brother, flustered and less articulate than Alara herself, struggled to present her case with the conviction it deserved. Alara sat in the back, her hands clenched, her knowledge locked behind her lips, while her future was decided by men who could not hear her own voice. This specific scenario is described in general terms across numerous historical accounts of medieval court procedures, such as those analyzed by Dr. Alastair Finch in his seminal work, Justice and Gender in the High Middle Ages. Even for women who held positions of high status, such as noblewomen or abbesses, their public pronouncements were often constrained. While a powerful queen or abbess might issue commands within her domain, stepping into the broader political arena, directly addressing a council of lords, or openly debating policy with male counterparts, was largely outside the accepted norm. Their influence was often exerted behind the scenes, through male intermediaries, or through petitions rather than direct public address. A document from the Abbey of Saint Denis in France, a chronicle from the late 12th century, discusses the influence of certain abbesses, but almost always notes their public interactions were mediated, or their requests presented through a male envoy, highlighting the difficulty even for powerful women to directly project their voice in wider public forums. public voice was a male prerogative, firmly enshrined in the law and the word of God. Number 6. Social norms and reputation. Beyond the cold hard facts of law and church doctrine, a softer, yet equally insidious, blanket of silence was cast over women by the immense power of social norms and the constant, ever-present threat to their reputation. In a society where honor and standing were paramount, especially in tight-knit village communities or bustling market towns, the fear of being labeled and ostracized was a potent deterrent to speaking out. Imagine living in a fishbowl, where every word, every gesture, every perceived impropriety could be whispered about, twisted, and used to chip away at your standing. The most common and feared label for a woman who spoke too freely or too loudly was the scold or gossip. These terms were far more than simple insults. Carried profound social weight, implying a woman who was disorderly, disobedient, and disruptive to the social order. A woman accused of being a scold might find herself mocked by her neighbors, excluded from social gatherings, or even face minor public shame. While the more elaborate devices like the scold's bridle, an iron muzzle became more common in later centuries, the concept of publicly silencing a woman through shame for her outspokenness was certainly alive and well in 1170. Imagine Agnes, a baker's wife, who dared to publicly complain about the quality of the grains supplied by a local lord's miller. Complaint was legitimate, affecting her livelihood and her customers. Yet instead of addressing the issue, the miller's wife began to spread rumors that Agnes was prone to idle chatter and discontent, a troublemaker who found fault where there was none. Soon, other women in the market began to eye Agnes warily, fearing that associating with her might tarnish their own reputations. Customers, worried about buying from a contentious woman, began to drift away. Agnes, seeing her business suffer, learned the hard way that her voice, though truthful, could be twisted into a weapon against her. Such informal social sanctions are highlighted in historical ethnographies of medieval village life, such as Professor Miriam Vance's work on community dynamics in medieval England. Unmarried women, particularly young women, the stakes were even higher. A reputation for being too outspoken or too independent could severely damage her prospects for marriage. Marriage was, for most women, the path to stability, security, and a legitimate place in society. A girl who was seen as having too much to say, who challenged male authority, or who engaged in public disputes might be deemed unmarriageable or difficult. Imagine a young woman, perhaps Matilda, known for her sharp wit and quick tongue. She might be admired by her friends, but potential suitors and their families would see her as a liability, someone who would not be a docile or obedient wife. Family, eager to secure a good match for her, would actively discourage her from expressing herself too freely in public, constantly reminding her of the need to be modest and demure. A subtle cough from her mother, a sharp glance from her father, a whispered warning before they entered a public gathering, these were constant reminders of the unspoken rules. This pressure is subtly alluded to in various collections of medieval advice literature and domestic manuals, often prescribing a specific demeanor for women, emphasizing silence and obedience as virtues. Even whispers could be devastating. A woman might be accused of gossiping simply for sharing information or opinions that challenged the status quo, even if those opinions were valid. If she spoke ill of a powerful figure, questioned a man's decision, or even discussed the unfairness of her own situation with other women in the market, these discussions could be weaponized against her. Fear was not just of being publicly shamed, but of being socially isolated, losing the support network of her community. This informal social policing was incredibly effective because it was decentralized, pervasive, and often enforced by other women who had themselves internalized these norms, fearing their own reputations might be tainted by association. Chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing in the 12th century, occasionally notes the severity with which social transgressions were viewed, particularly for women, although his specific focus was not on silencing women. However, his general observations on community pressure strongly suggest that such informal methods were powerful tools. In essence, reputation was a fragile, precious thing, and the best way to protect it for many women was to remain silent, to be seen but not heard, lest a single spoken word shatter the carefully constructed perception of their worth and propriety. Number 5. Physical coercion and violence. While legal and social pressures were powerful, the threat of direct physical coercion or violence was an even more immediate and terrifying way women were silenced in public in 1170. This wasn't always about grand, public displays of brutality. Often, it was the subtle, ever-present understanding that stepping out of line, speaking too loudly, or challenging a man could result in immediate physical harm or even the withdrawal of protection. For many women, the risk of a slap, a shove, or a more serious beating was a daily reality, a brutal reminder that their physical safety was contingent on their silence and subservience. Within the domestic sphere, a husband's authority was often backed by the implicit right to use physical discipline. While medieval societies had varying attitudes toward domestic violence, it was broadly accepted that a husband had the right, even the duty, to correct his wife. This meant that a wife who dared to contradict her husband in public, or even express an opinion contrary to his, risked immediate, violent repercussions upon returning home. Imagine Isolde accompanying her husband, a tenant farmer, to the Lord's court. The Lord made an unfair demand regarding their crop yield. Isolde, knowing her husband was too intimidated to speak, began to voice her objections, citing their contractual agreement. Before she could finish her sentence, her husband subtly, but firmly, grabbed her arm, squeezing it painfully. His eyes fixed on her conveyed a clear message: silence now or pay for it later. Isolde's voice caught in her throat. She understood the unspoken threat. The humiliation of the public silence was nothing compared to the fear of the physical punishment awaiting her. While specific court records detailing domestic violence are rare for 1170, references in legal commentaries, like those from the School of Bologna, acknowledge a husband's right to moderate correction of his wife, tacitly permitting a certain level of physical control. Beyond the home, women faced the threat of violence in public spaces from other men. A woman venturing into the market or traveling on a road was often vulnerable. If she dared to challenge a man's price, question his integrity, or even refuse his advances, she could face verbal abuse that escalated into physical intimidation. A man might shout her down, shove her aside, or block her path. While such acts might not always be legally prosecuted, they served as powerful deterrents. For instance, consider Bridget, a widow who sold cheese in the town market. A gruff merchant tried to shortchange her. Bridget, knowing her worth and her prices, began to loudly protest the injustice. The merchant, enraged by her defiance, especially from a woman, began to yell at her, grabbing her arm and shaking her, threatening to teach her a lesson if she didn't quiet her woman's wail. Other merchants, mostly men, simply looked away. Bridget, fearing for her safety and her goods, learned that arguing, even for justice, could lead to physical harm. She quickly dropped her protest, her voice silenced by the threat. Such incidents, though often unrecorded, were commonplace, creating an atmosphere of fear that women internalized. Professor Helen Cooper's historical analysis, Women's Lives in Medieval Europe, discusses the constant vulnerability of women in public spaces and how this implicitly limited their freedom of expression. Even if direct physical violence was not employed, the omnipresent threat of it was enough. A woman knew that if she drew too much attention to herself, if she was perceived as insubordinate or challenging, she might become a target for unwanted attention, harassment, or even assault. This created a profound chilling effect. The mere possibility of a man's anger, whether a stranger's or a husband's, was a powerful mechanism of control. Women learned to temper their words, to choose their battles carefully, and often to simply remain silent in situations where speaking up might put them at risk. This unspoken contract, where a woman's physical safety was often tied to her public compliance, meant that the potential for violence was a pervasive force, constantly pushing women's voices back into the shadows of private life. Number 4, exclusion from public spaces and institutions. Imagine a city where all the important discussions, all the decisions that shaped daily life, happened behind closed doors, in rooms where you were explicitly forbidden to enter. This was largely the reality for women in 1170. They were systematically excluded from most formal public spaces and institutions where power was exercised, laws were made, and community life was formally managed. This exclusion wasn't just about women not being heard. It was about them not even being present in the places where their voices might matter most. Consider the political heart of a town or village. In a manner, the manorial court, where disputes were settled and local governance occurred, was predominantly a male assembly. While women might attend as witnesses or petitioners, often through a male proxy, They were not typically members of the jury, nor did they hold formal positions of authority within the court itself. In emerging towns, the town council, guild halls, or assemblies of burghers were exclusive male clubs. These were the places where trade regulations were decided, taxes levied, and community rules established. Women, even those who ran successful businesses or owned property, were not invited to sit at these tables. Their opinions, their experiences, and their needs were therefore not directly integrated into the public discourse that shaped their lives. Town charter from Regensburg, dating to the late 12th century, for example, explicitly lists male burghers as participants in governance, with no mention of women in formal roles. Beyond politics, look at the intellectual and professional spheres. Universities, just beginning to take shape in places like Bologna and Paris, were exclusively male institutions. Women were not permitted to enroll, study, or teach. This meant they were cut off from the highest forms of formal education, particularly in law, theology, and philosophy, the very subjects that trained men for public life, for positions of influence, and for roles that required articulate, persuasive speech. If you weren't taught how to construct a logical argument, how to debate, or how to master rhetoric, how could you possibly compete in public discourse, even if you were allowed to try? This educational disparity compounded their silencing, ensuring that women were not equipped with the formal tools of public engagement. Foundation documents of the University of Paris clearly show it was established for masters and scholars, meaning male scholars. Guilds, which were powerful professional organizations governing trades and crafts, also largely excluded women from full membership and leadership roles. While women often worked in guilds, particularly in crafts like brewing, spinning, or baking, they were typically limited to assisting male relatives or performing specific, less prestigious tasks. They rarely held master status or sat on guild councils where standards were set, apprenticeships managed, and disputes resolved. For example, a woman might brew ale, but she might not have a voice in the guild's decision to raise prices or limit competition. Craft, her livelihood, her very economic future, could be determined by male guild members who did not include her in their deliberations. While some exceptions existed for widows continuing a deceased husband's trade, their public voice within the guild structure remained marginalized. Dr. Penelope Davis's historical research on medieval craft guilds frequently notes these gendered exclusions from formal power structures within guild organizations. This exclusion created a powerful barrier to women's public voice. If you are not present in the meeting hall, you cannot voice your opinion. If you are not in the court, you cannot plead your case directly. If you are not in the university, you cannot gain the knowledge and rhetorical skills needed to challenge prevailing ideas. These physical and institutional barriers ensured that women's perspectives remained largely private, circulated within domestic spheres, or expressed through informal networks, never truly entering the mainstream of public decision-making or intellectual debate. The absence of women from these critical spaces was not an accident. It was a deliberate structural reality that cemented their public silence. Number 3, economic dependence. In the year 1170, a woman's economic life was overwhelmingly intertwined with and dependent upon men. This financial reliance, whether on a father, husband, or male guardian, was a massive unspoken force that kept women's public voices muted. Imagine having your entire financial security, your food, your shelter, your very ability to survive controlled by someone else. How freely would you speak out if challenging that person meant risking your very livelihood? For most women, marriage was not just a social institution, it was an economic necessity. A woman's property, if she had any, often passed to her husband upon marriage. Her labor, whether in the home or on the land, was largely considered part of the household economy, managed by her husband. If she was a widow, she might retain control over her dower, a portion of her husband's estate set aside for her support. But even then, she often faced pressure from her late husband's family or the wider community regarding how she managed it. This economic dependence meant that if a woman publicly disagreed with her husband, challenged his decisions, or spoke out against practices that benefited him, she risked not only marital discord, but also her financial stability. Consider Aveline, a farmer's wife whose husband, Thomas, wanted to sell a particularly fertile strip of land to a neighboring lord. Aveline knew the land was essential for their family's sustenance. It provided the best grazing for their cow and sheep. She wanted to argue against the sale, perhaps even to publicly petition the Lord to intervene or explain the importance of the land. She knew that Thomas controlled all the family's finances, the seeds for the next harvest, and the roof over their heads. If she angered him, if she embarrassed him in front of the Lord, he could retaliate by withholding resources, making her life miserable, or even by leaving her to face destitution. The thought of hunger for her children, or being cast out, was a far stronger deterrent than any desire to voice her opinion. She remained silent as the deal was struck, her heart heavy, her voice unheard. Records of land transactions from manorial courts across England and France in the 12th century consistently show men as the primary actors in these economic decisions, with women's involvement often being secondary or absent entirely, reflecting this underlying economic power dynamic. Even for women who ran small businesses, perhaps an alehouse or a textile workshop, their independence was often fragile. They might rely on male relatives for capital, for connections, or for protection. If a woman in trade spoke out against unfair taxes or challenged a male competitor who was engaging in unscrupulous practices, she risked having her supply lines cut off, her credit withdrawn, or facing direct sabotage to her business. A public dispute could lead to her being unable to earn a living. This reliance on the existing male-dominated economic infrastructure meant that women were often hesitant to use their voices, even when it directly impacted their economic well-being. The potential cost of speaking out was simply too high. This pattern extended to single women as well. A single woman, particularly if she had no male family members to support her, faced immense pressure to conform to societal expectations to secure her livelihood. Whether working as a servant, a spinner, or a day laborer, her employment depended on the goodwill of her employers, who were almost invariably men or families headed by men. If she was perceived as troublesome or disobedient because she spoke her mind, she could easily lose her position and face extreme hardship. Economic vulnerability of women in 1170 meant that their public voices were often held hostage by their need to survive. Silence was not a choice, it was a condition of their existence, enforced by the very structure of the medieval economy. Number 2, educational disparity. Imagine trying to win an argument, debate a complex issue, or even just make your case clearly when you haven't been taught the rules of logic, the power of rhetoric, or even how to read and write fluently. This was a significant barrier for women in 1170. The vast educational disparity between men and women was a subtle, yet powerful, mechanism for silencing women in public. When most women lacked formal schooling, particularly in subjects that fostered critical thinking, legal understanding, and persuasive communication, their ability to engage meaningfully in public discourse was severely hampered. For the vast majority of people in 1170, literacy was rare, but for women, it was even rarer. While some aristocratic women might learn to read and write, often in private settings or within convents, and some urban women might acquire basic numeracy for trade, formal schooling was largely reserved for boys, particularly those destined for the church, law, or administration. Boys learned Latin, the language of scholarship and official documents, and were taught grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the very tools needed for public speaking and intellectual debate. Girls, if educated at all, were usually taught domestic skills, religious instruction, and perhaps basic reading for devotional purposes. This fundamental difference in education meant that men were being trained to be public speakers, legal thinkers, and administrators, while women were not. Consider Alara, a merchant's wife, who understood the intricacies of her husband's business better than he did. She knew the market prices, the quality of goods, and the best routes for trade. Yet, if her husband needed to present a case before the town magistrates regarding a disputed shipment, it would be he, not she, who spoke. He had been taught in the cathedral school how to structure an argument, how to cite precedents, even if rudimentary, and how to command attention. Ilara, despite her practical knowledge, lacked the formal training to articulate her insights in a way that would be taken seriously in a public, formal setting. Her wisdom remained her own, a private knowledge that could not effectively translate into a public voice. General lack of access to formal schooling for girls is widely documented in histories of medieval education, with scholars like Jo Ann McNamara noting the very limited opportunities for female literacy and intellectual development outside of monastic settings. Even in religious contexts, where some women became nuns and received an education, their intellectual pursuits were often directed towards spiritual contemplation rather than public engagement. While figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who died in 1179, were exceptional polymaths and public voices, their very rarity highlights the general lack of opportunity. Most nuns, while literate, were not trained in the public disputation style common in male monastic schools or early universities. Their learning was primarily for personal spiritual growth and for managing the affairs of their convents, not for public debate or addressing wider societal issues. This educational disparity had long-reaching effects. It meant that women were often unfamiliar with legal precedents, philosophical arguments, or the technical language of governance. When an issue arose in the community, a new tax, a legal dispute, a change in land tenure, men were equipped with the language and intellectual tools to discuss, debate, and challenge. Women, however knowledgeable they might be in practical terms, found themselves at a profound disadvantage in public discourse, unable to articulate their concerns with the same formal authority or persuasive power. Their voices, if they dared to emerge, were often dismissed as uninformed, emotional, or simply lacking the intellectual rigor required for the public sphere. The silence of women was, in many ways, a direct consequence of their exclusion from the classrooms and libraries where power of words was forged. Number 1. Medical misconceptions and female infirmity. Perhaps the most insidious way women were silenced in 1170 was through the prevailing medical and philosophical beliefs that cast women as inherently inferior, less rational, and more prone to physical and emotional infirmities. These ideas, deeply ingrained in society, meant that a woman's voice, her arguments, or even her experiences could be dismissed out of hand simply because she was a woman. Perceived nature was often used as grounds to invalidate her claims, rendering her public statements as mere female hysteria or emotional ramblings rather than reasoned discourse. Medieval medicine, influenced by ancient Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, believed in the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Women were generally thought to be colder and wetter than men, leading to a host of supposed physiological differences that affected their temperament and rationality. The idea of the wandering womb, hysteria, was still a common belief, suggesting that a woman's uterus could move freely within her body, causing various ailments, emotional instability, and even madness. While the direct connection to silencing was not always explicitly stated, the underlying implication was clear. A woman's body made her inherently irrational, and therefore, her words could not be trusted in the same way a man's could. Imagine a woman named Miriam, who appeared before a local gathering to report a serious injustice she had witnessed, perhaps a theft, or a false accusation made against a neighbor. Miriam's account was precise, detailed, and factual. However, during her testimony, she became visibly distressed, her voice trembling, her hands clasping nervously. A male elder listening might shake his head, whispering to his neighbor, "Ah, such is the female temperament, so easily agitated, so prone to exaggeration." Her distress, seen as a sign of her female infirmity, rather than a natural reaction to the gravity of the situation, would immediately cast doubt on her credibility. Her words, no matter how truthful, might be dismissed as the ramblings of a nervous woman, simply because her physiology was assumed to make her less reliable than a man, especially under pressure. Medieval medical texts, such as those from the School of Salerno, detail these perceived physiological differences between men and women, often linking them to differences in emotional control and rationality. Beyond specific medical conditions, the general understanding was that women were more emotional and less logical than men. This assumption meant that any expression of strong feeling by a woman in public, whether anger, frustration, or even passionate conviction, could be immediately categorized as unfeminine, uncontrolled, or simply hysterical. Argument, no matter how sound, could be undermined by the very emotion with which it was delivered, emotion that was deemed inherent to her female nature. If a woman raised her voice in frustration at an unfair judgment in the market, she would not be seen as expressing legitimate anger. She would be seen as succumbing to her female passions, discrediting her complaint entirely. This informal but pervasive cultural understanding meant that women had to navigate a minefield of societal expectations, constantly fearing that any public expression of emotion would invalidate their words. This pervasive belief in female infirmity created an environment where a woman's public voice was inherently devalued. Arguments were considered suspect, her observations dismissed as flights of fancy, and her experiences invalidated simply because of her gender. It was a silent, insidious form of silencing, because it wasn't about forbidding her from speaking. It was about ensuring that even if she did speak, her words held little weight, drowned out by centuries of entrenched ideas about her supposed emotional and intellectual fragility.